Let's make a start, and we have semi-apologies, I think, from Mr. Scott, who has to leave for the referendum committee at some point. Sincerely apologises there. Can I welcome everyone to this, our 17th meeting of this session, and ask everyone to make sure their phones are off. And our business this morning is two panels but a single topic, the Scotland Act 2012, and then we will consider our approach to this topic. Can I have the committee's agreement that we do that in private? Item 4. Thank you very much. Our first panel is from Audit Scotland, Auditor General, Mark Taylor and Russell Firth. Russell is the Assistant Auditor General and Mark is the Assistant Director of the Audit Services Group. So I invite the Auditor General to make some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Convener. The Scotland Act 2012 makes significant changes to Scotland's public finances, and we're grateful for the opportunity to discuss the audit implications of those changes with the committee at this early stage. My colleagues are Russell Firth, who's responsible for audit policy and quality within Audit Scotland, and Mark Taylor, who leads the annual audit of the Scottish Government. I'll be relying on them to help me answer questions that you may have about the financial implications of the Act. The financial provisions cover new borrowing powers and devolved taxes, as well as the Scottish rate of income tax. We think the devolved taxes are relatively straightforward. They'll be set by the Scottish Parliament and collected by Revenue Scotland and bodies such as Registers of Scotland and SEPA. There will be a one-off adjustment to the block grant, and the revenue raised by the devolved taxes will be audited through the usual arrangements for auditing Revenue Scotland once it's formally established, and through the existing audits of the Scottish Government, SEPA and Registers of Scotland. The Scottish rate of income tax is different in that it will lead to an adjustment to the amount of money transferred from Westminster to Scotland each year, and as you heard yesterday, it will be collected by HMRC as part of its responsibilities for collecting income tax across the UK. Audit Scotland hasn't been involved in auditing the amount of the Scottish block grant transferred from Westminster, which has been heavily influenced by the application of the Barnett formula and formalised by the annual Westminster Budget and Appropriation Act. The introduction of the Scottish rate of income tax brings added complexity and volatility to the amount of money that's available to the Scottish Government each year. The Scottish rate of income tax will be set by the Scottish Parliament, but it will be administered and collected by HMRC as part of its wider responsibilities for income tax. As you heard yesterday, HMRC is audited by the National Audit Office, and our powers and responsibilities in Audit Scotland don't include access to HMRC. The Scottish rate of income tax revenue will be only a small part of the work of HMRC, although it is, of course, much more significant to Scotland. My concern is to help ensure that the Scottish Parliament is able to receive appropriate levels of assurance about the operation of the Scottish rate of income tax and the resulting adjustments to the amount of block grant received in Scotland. For us, the main audit issues fall into 5 categories. First, accounting, accountability and regularity. Second, financial management. Third, project management. Fourth, the setup and running costs involved. And fifth, tax collection and the impact on the block grant. We think the first 4 are relatively straightforward from an audit perspective once the arrangements have been finalised. We can contribute to the overall assurance in these areas by reviewing the assurance and control mechanisms the Scottish Government puts in place with HMRC through the Memorandum of Understanding, and by commenting on the level of assurance received from HMRC and the NAO. We can also audit any expenditure incurred by the Scottish Government during the set-up phase as part of the audit of the accounts of the Scottish Government, and assuming that they are invoiced to the Government in line with the draft Memorandum of Understanding, we can also audit the set-up and running costs incurred by HMRC to some extent. The collection of the Scottish rate of income tax and its impact on the block grant, however, are new areas for all of us, and it's important that there are clear and transparent arrangements for reporting. We're grateful for the opportunity to discuss the audit implications of these changes with the Public-Audit-Committee as the accountability and audit arrangements are taking shape, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Maybe I could just kick off. We had, as you know, yesterday, evidence from Mr. Morse, who is your equivalent in the NEO. And it seemed to me that he was implying that the arrangements as they've been described, perhaps, how can I put it, didn't require HMRC to provide detailed enough information on the ongoing collection of the Scottish rate of income tax. And I just wondered what your sense of that was.
I think our view is that it's not yet clear enough. We've had the opportunity to see the draft Memorandum of Understanding as you have, and there is provision in there for the income and expenditure related to SRIT to be included in HMRC's accounts. It's not clear about the level of detail that will need to be set out in those accounts, therefore what the level of audit coverage will be by my counterpart in the NAO, and therefore what assurance can come back to the Scottish Parliament. We think that's a developmental issue. As I said in my opening remarks, this is all new to all of us. But our view is that it's important to be clear how much detail is there, and for that detail to be sufficient for the Scottish Parliament to take assurance, which is probably a higher level than would be necessary for assurance about HMRC's collection of income tax across the UK.
Clearly, in terms of your responsibilities as Auditor General, you have a statutory basis for the work that you do. Mr. Morse also seemed to imply yesterday that he felt he needed a stronger statutory basis for his audit of the collection of the Scottish rate of income tax. And again, I just wonder what your view was on that.
Again, it's an area that's developing. At the moment, it's very clear what Amias Morse's powers are as CNAG for auditing HMRC and for reporting to the UK Parliament. It's not clear on what basis he would be reporting to the Scottish Parliament or producing a report for consideration by the Scottish Parliament. Equally, although there's a long history of close working between the NAO and Audit Scotland that we would expect to continue as the Scottish rate of income tax comes in, it's not clear on what basis I could report to the Scottish Parliament on a report produced by the CNAG in Westminster. So there's just a bit of fine-tuning there to do, I think, about the audit powers as opposed to the tax collection and setting powers.
I mean, Mr. Morse did make what seemed to me a curious suggestion that he could carry out the audit, but in some way that you, as the Auditor General for Scotland, could report to the Scottish Parliament. And I wondered what your view was of that exchange.
I think we're all grappling with the implications of a new way of collecting tax. We're talking about a shared income tax base here with receipts shared between the UK Parliament and the Scottish Parliament. We haven't been in this position before, and we're working through how those might work in practice. I think it's very clear that the NAO is the auditor of HMRC and will continue to be so. They are willing to do additional work to audit whatever method of accounting for the Scottish rate of income tax is agreed, and that is the right route for providing that professional coverage of the revenue and expenditure involved. The bit that we haven't worked through yet is how that's reported to the Scottish Parliament as opposed to the UK Parliament. We're both committed to working together to make that happen, but there isn't currently a statutory underpinning, and we do need to think about what's most effective both in terms of the work involved and providing assurance to the Scottish Parliament in ways that are clear-cut and maintain the right accountability.
Okay, thanks very much, Ms Scanlon.
I wonder if I can just pursue the question that I asked yesterday. I got the impression from the witnesses yesterday that they were very keen to work together, very keen to listen to what we had to say, and very keen to make sure that what's right for Scotland happens, and I hope that that's the case. I certainly would not want a lot of duplication of effort. I don't think that's helpful. But what I would like to hear from you, Auditor General, is at the outset, where we can have a positive and constructive input into overseeing the collection of this tax, what level of detail and information do you think that we need from HMRC? And if I can just give the examples I gave yesterday, would you expect, well, I think you mentioned this already, progress report on the setting up of the system and the costs, the Scottish taxpayers' compliance levels, is that something that you feel would be essential? Customer service performance in relation to Scottish taxpayer queries, its performance in collecting Scottish taxes, and also things like Scottish taxpayers, the level of error, fraud and write-offs. So it would be very helpful at the outset if you could tell us exactly what you feel would be in Scotland's best interest to meet this appropriate level of assurance mentioned in your introductory remarks.
I think there's two strands to that are worth separating out. The first is the requirement within HMRC's accounts for how the Scottish rate of income tax is covered. The Memorandum of Understanding helpfully is clear that income and expenditure associated with the SRIT will be recorded in HMRC's accounts. It doesn't yet specify in what level of detail, and we think it would be helpful to make sure that's an appropriate level of detail, perhaps a separate statement within HMRC's accounts that would be the focus of the National Audit Office audit and then of any assurance provided to the Scottish Parliament.
Sorry.
The second strand is about the performance information which you as a Parliament may want to have reported from HMRC, and there's a range of options in there. I think what you heard yesterday is that most of that performance information would be the information which HMRC already reports about income tax collection, and that if you and that if you want to add new elements of performance information from that, there may be a cost implication. It seems to us that now is the right time to be having that discussion about what additional information is needed by the Parliament here in Scotland, to build that in at this stage, and to make sure that the costs and benefits of that information are clearly understood.
Okay, well, under those two headings, I mean, it seems that there is a sort of ballpark figure for the Scottish rate of income tax. What do you think would be the appropriate level of detail that would benefit working in this Parliament? And what do you think would be the appropriate performance information? I mentioned one or two things, compliance, fraud, write-offs, whatever. I'm really just asking for a steer under those two headings, what you feel would be important at this stage of the proceedings.
I think it is a decision for the Parliament, but I do think there is absolute value in the Parliament having a clear picture of compliance, collection rates, and the variation that may exist between those and the remainder of the UK income tax base. And I think as you go beyond that, there's an important discussion to be had about the trade-off between cost and benefit that always comes into account. Russell Frith may want to add to that slightly. Russell.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Some of the things that you mentioned, such as the performance in collecting Scottish tax, the level of write-offs, absolutely should be things that are readily separately identified for Scotland. Some of the others, I think there's more of a discussion to be had perhaps, such as the level of customer service performance, because as I think you heard yesterday, HMRC operate a lot of its call centres and the like on a UK basis. It would be probably quite difficult to separately extract that type of information.
Right, that's very helpful, thank you.
Mr Griffin.
On issues of collection and performance and recording of data, the block grant given to Scotland will be on the basis of the Office for Budget Responsibility and their forecast, and then it will be reconciled with the actual receipt. So will the data for the overall picture of Scottish rate of income tax collection, will that data not have to be gathered to allow that reconciliation to take place?
The absolute level collected certainly will be. I think the question is whether there are differences in compliance, levels of outstanding tax, levels of bad debt between Scottish taxpayers and the rest of UK taxpayers that you may want to explore. They wouldn't have a direct impact on the revenue in the year or on the reconciliation that was carried out, but they may be of interest to the Parliament in the wider question of the way the Scottish rate of income tax is being administered on its behalf by HMRC.
And on the collection, on performance of collection, if there are variances in performance across the UK and in Scotland, do you think it's appropriate that there's a possible impact on the Scottish budget as a result of variances in performance across the UK, and this Parliament, the Parliament which will be impacted by that difference in rates of collection, doesn't have a line of accountability to HMRC in challenging why there could be differences in performance across the UK?
I think we heard yesterday from Mr Troop that the collection of the Scottish rate of income tax would be no different from collection of income tax across the piece. And therefore, all of us would expect there'd be no difference in terms of collection levels or compliance for Scottish ratepayers against all other income tax payers. I think where that starts to get interesting is if we look ahead to potentially different tax rates in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK, where there may be different incentives for people to avoid or evade tax payment, and also in questions of the identification of Scottish taxpayers and some of the challenges that may come up as that develops. It's one of the reasons why having the information is useful, although I suspect that certainly in the transitional period there's not a great likelihood that anything done by HMRC would affect the levels of income available to Scotland during that period.
Yep, I think you're right. When the rate of income tax stays the same as it is with the rest of the UK, there won't be issues, but if it is varied, then there will be issues with collection. I think the question is still there. If the rate is ever changed, do you think there's an issue with not having a direct line of accountability to that body?
I think that's the reason why getting the reporting and accountability arrangements clear and agreed now is so important. Having it done in advance of any potential problems arising is obviously preferable to trying to sort it out once there is a concern that needs to be addressed. We are dealing with a shared tax base with different proportions of the tax revenues coming to the Scottish Parliament and the UK Parliament. That's a new situation for all of us. The arrangements set out in the Memorandum of Understanding take us a long way towards resolving it, but I think there are just a couple of things that could do with further agreement at this stage of development of the new system.
Thank you, Mr Griffin. Ms White.
Much convener. Good morning again. You mentioned, yesterday we were asking questions, and one of the questions that I did ask is about between the set-up 40-45 million, not too sure where it falls, but £10 million going into IT, and obviously Audit Scotland did the report on IT systems and certainly, IT contracts, and certainly we've had a number of problems in that respect. As Audit Scotland and obviously the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament is going to be paying this money, what role will you have in, when the contract is put out, say the £10 million that they say for ICT contracts, what role will Audit Scotland have in that? And the £35 million which is left, estimated £35 million, when asked what that money was being spent on, we were told it would be spent on advertising, mail mergers, postage, that type of thing. What input will Audit Scotland have into looking at that and making sure that the Scottish Government gets value for money?
The set-up and running cost is one of the areas where I think the Memorandum of Understanding is actually very helpful in moving us on. I'll ask Mark Taylor to talk you through our current thinking in that area. Mark.
Thank you. I think our current thinking is that there are a number of options about how deep we can go in relation to those issues. Some of those are straightforward from an audit perspective, and some of those need further development of audit arrangements in the way which Caroline's described. I think at a very simplistic level, this is expenditure that goes through the Scottish Government accounts, and it's subject to audit as part of the Scottish Government accounts, and we will certainly look to do that. And similarly, we'll certainly look at the Scottish Government's arrangements for assuring value for money, the right information, the right reporting, and the right project management in those areas. And again, we would expect to do that as part of the audit. I think beyond that, I think we're looking at the opportunities for discussion with the National Audit Office as to how we can work with them to look at in a little more detail about some of the data and information that's available about the basis of costing and the basis of charging. I think the challenge here is that this is a unique circumstance. There are no benchmarks. There is no competition for us to make an absolute comparison in value for money grounds. But in those circumstances, which we're used to in a number of areas, it's very much about the arrangements they're set up and our ability to understand and audit those.
Thank you. Just to follow on, Chair, I know that Caroline had mentioned progress, reporting on progress. We don't have, well, we have a timescale, but we don't know when the contracts are going to be out, and we don't know how the money is going to be spent. Will Audit Scotland be reporting on the progress of that as it goes through to the Audit Committee?
If I can pick that one up as well. Again, as part of the Scottish Government audit, we are already having an oversight, if you like, of the progress that the Scottish Government and its partners are making in addressing this issue, and we report to them on that progress. Out of that work, there's an opportunity where it would be appropriate for us to report to this Parliament using a number of vehicles where there's issues to bring to your attention, and that's something that we would keep under review and discussion with Auditor General.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks. Mr Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Mention was made just briefly earlier about Revenue Scotland. Just for my own mind, can you just confirm, is Audit Scotland actually auditing the two taxes being collected by Revenue Scotland?
We don't yet know the detailed arrangements for the collection of the devolved taxes. We know that Revenue Scotland will be set up to oversee collection, and they'll work closely with Register of Scotland and SEPA, but it's clear under the powers that I have in the Public Finance and Accountability Act that we will be able to appoint auditors to Revenue Scotland, as we do to the two existing bodies, and to audit the set-up and collection of taxes under those arrangements.
Perhaps we'll get a rebate from the National Audit Office because they don't have to audit that part of the business. The Scottish Accounting Officer, I mean, what became clear yesterday when I was asking questions about this is it's not a statutory post. Are there any significant implications from the fact that it's not a statutory post in terms of reporting to the Parliament or whatever?
I think the issue is that it's an accounting officer under the UK legislation with a reporting line to the UK Parliament, but not to the Scottish Parliament. And the memorandum makes it clear that the committee or the Parliament and its committees can invite the additional accounting officer to give evidence to the Parliament, and that the additional accounting officer will respond to those invitations. But it's not a power to compel, I think, and it's not a direct accounting line to this Parliament in the way that Scottish accountable officers are accountable to this Parliament. Again, I think it's an inevitable consequence of the shared income tax base that we're working with. But I think there is an opportunity to clarify further in the agreements put in place at this stage how those arrangements will work, and perhaps particularly what will happen in the event of disagreement, if that ever occurs.
And just to be absolutely clear, that obviously means that Public-Audit-Committee has no power to ask them to come and, well, we can ask them, but they're not required to come and give evidence.
It's clear in the memorandum that you have the power to ask them, and the expectation is that they will respond, but it's not a direct accountability relationship in the same way that Scottish accountable officers are required to give evidence to the Scottish Parliament.
Yesterday when I was asking questions, I was asking about the £45 million costs of setting all this up. And I think, certainly for me, for the first time, I heard that £10 million of that was IT costs. Do we actually know, and I don't know whether this is something that Audit Scotland's been involved in at all, do we know anything about the breakdown of this £45 million?
At this stage, I don't think we know very much about it, although I'll ask Mark to come in a moment. I think what all of us are currently working with are the high-level estimates that were produced during the passage of the bill into the Act earlier this year, and detailed planning has started during this calendar year to take that forward. Mark, do you want to add to that?
I think really just to confirm that we've no great insight into the breakdown and detail of that. I think yesterday there was a reflection that it was a high-level estimate and there will be a number of components of that expenditure. I think we'd recognise that those are the sort of things we would expect money to be spent on, but as to the detailed amounts that are allocated to each, again, we don't have any information to be able to share with the committee.
It seems that when you come down to it, we don't have a lot of information on an awful lot of things about this arrangement that's being set up. I know it's early days. From the point of view of Audit Scotland, obviously there's concern, I think, in this committee and elsewhere about how Audit Scotland's going to interface with HMRC and NAO and all the rest of it. Hopefully, you're taking a proactive approach and engaging with HMRC and NAO. I don't know what sort of existing relationship you've had with them, but I just want to confirm that you are taking a proactive approach to try and engage with them and reach some sort of a modus operandi with them. And I don't know if the Scottish Government's expressed any views at all, other than what we've seen in the memorandum and so on, as regards your involvement with those two bodies.
At this stage, we're engaging very closely with the National Audit Office and with the Scottish Government to understand how their thinking is developing and to play in our own views about what's needed to ensure the Scottish Parliament has the assurance that it needs. We haven't had direct contact with HMRC because we don't have any statutory basis for that, but I'm comfortable that our working relationship with the National Audit Office is close enough that we're not missing any important factors in doing that. I think it is the next stage in developing the accounting and audit arrangements for the new powers in line with the discussions you're having more widely at the moment.
Mr Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. I wonder if I could make a number of points and ask the Auditor General and our staff for their views. I think she's been incredibly diplomatic as ever. I think the Memorandum of Understanding doesn't really give Audit Scotland the place that I think we require it to have in this entire process. I get the sense that Audit Scotland is kind of being treated as an interested third party in this process. I think its importance to the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament means that it should have a far more defined and clear role expressed in the Memorandum of Understanding, and I don't think it is, Convener. I don't think it's clear and strong enough what the roles and relationships are. And I think that's reflected in the fact that there are so many questions and so many unknowns about the line of accountability for our principal body that does this work on our behalf. So I don't know what the members' views are, but that's certainly my view. In terms of costs, the set-up costs, the maintenance costs and so on, and also the OBR, they will make the first estimate of the block grant reduction. And I wonder, is there to be agreement on that, or will they decide that? I think it's important that in circumstances like this, that there needs to be agreement in order to proceed. The last thing I think we would want, I think, between both governments, Convener, is disagreement on the set-up costs and running costs for the administration of the system, and then disagreement about the amount of block grant that was actually reduced, because that could be very, very significant in terms of the Scottish budget. So I would just say at this stage, in the absence of any clarity, I would ask that we perhaps press for agreement to be reached, rather than a decision to be made by our UK partners on this business. I'd like to make a point too on the possibilities of the yes-no outcome to the referendum. And this is not a political point, Convener, it's a point as an auditor. I do think there's a responsibility on the part of both governments to prepare the ground for either outcome. The last thing I think that we want is for there to be a sense of money wasted depending on one or other of the outcomes. And I think it's incumbent on the system at both sides of the border to prepare for both outcomes and to assure us and to assure the public that money has not been wasted. I don't know ultimately what the value of the OBR initial assessment could be. It could be £1 billion. I don't know. None of us know that. And as one of the Auditor General is cited in what that might be. But I think it's important that we begin to have that discussion, Convener, so that some clarity can begin to be brought to the table, so that proper decisions and proper planning can be made.
As you say, Mr Coffey, lots of points in there, and I'll try and touch on them each briefly. First of all, in relation to the audit powers, I think that is one of the areas we think needs further clarification within the Memorandum of Understanding. For us, I think it's developing well, but the two powers that could do with being clarified are, first of all, the level of detail required in HMRC's accounts around the Scottish rate of income tax, the revenue and costs associated with it, and secondly, the audit responsibilities of the NAO and Audit Scotland in relation to the two parliaments who have an interest in this. So it's early days, but I think there are areas where we feel that further development could be useful. In relation to the grant adjustment, you're absolutely right. There are two dimensions to this, and we mustn't lose sight of both of them. The first is the Scottish rate of income tax and the amount collected by it as we move through the transitional period into the steady state. And the second is the impact of the OBR forecasts, particularly in the transitional period. I don't have a view on the OBR forecasts, and it's not something we would have a view on, but the Parliament clearly does in looking at the way that will operate, the understanding between the Scottish Government and OBR about the way the process will work, and any mechanisms, again, that are in place for dealing with concerns about that. That's something which isn't covered by the Memorandum of Understanding, which is about the SRIT element of the adjustments, but the other is also important. I think the fourth point you made was about the referendum in 2014 and the potential for further significant change on the back of that. In many ways, I don't think I can add anything to what Mr. Troop said yesterday, that what we're preparing for now is something that's in legislation and is coming. We have got a significant professional interest in making sure those arrangements are put in place and that we use this transitional period between now and 2016 to do that as well as possible. If further change takes place after that, then I think this work will stand us all in good stead. But what we need to do for now is to prepare for what's currently in legislation.
Very briefly, do we know when the OBR will make the assessment of the first cut in the block grant? When will it be in relation to the referendum outcome? Will it be after it?
I think it would have to be after it in relation to anything other than what's currently in the Scotland Act and the framework that we're now working within.
And in terms of agreeing what that cut is there a discussion going on about there being an agreement about that, or is it going to be a decision taken by the OBR?
The OBR have issued a paper on forecasting Scotland's taxes, but I think that's a question better directed to the Scottish Government panel after this one.
Will do. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Mrs Scanlon has a follow-up.
Yes, it really is a supplementary to Colin Beattie and Willie Coffey. I hear what you're saying about the level of detail. I heard what was said yesterday about the willingness to work together, and I certainly wouldn't like anyone to think, well, Audit Scotland are totally excluded and we're not talking to them. That's not an impression that I've got. But what I really would like to get is, you did say you were engaging with HMRC, NAO, and you're very good relationships with them. Did you have any role into the drafting of the Memorandum of Understanding directly or indirectly? And secondly, are there any aspects of the Memorandum of Understanding that you feel are inappropriate, unacceptable, or unhelpful towards good working relations in future?
Our engagement has been with the NAO and with Scottish Government rather than HMRC, and we've had a lot of discussion with both of them about the broad questions and about the issues within the Memorandum of Understanding. Yeah. And the Scottish Government have invited our comments on the draft as it stands, and we're very happy to give them our detailed comments. I think it's fair to say there are no areas of the Memorandum that we think are unhelpful or pointing in the wrong direction. The one set of comments we'll be discussing with the Scottish Government is about the value of putting more flesh on the bones around the level of detail required in HMRC's accounts and the audit arrangements.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr Dornan.
Convener, we've been talking a lot about the relationship between yourselves, HMRC and NAO, and yesterday I agree with what Mary Scanlon said, that Mr Morse made it clear that he would be consulting with Audit Scotland and having a close working relationship with Audit Scotland. I also thought he made it clear that the decision eventually is in his lap, and whatever he decides as the outcome is the way that things will be. Now, given the importance to the block grant and therefore the ability of Parliament to do its job, how are you moving forward in the relationship with NAO and HMRC, NAO in particular? Do you have a timetable for when we'll know what the outcome will be of reporting back to this committee and the Parliament? And do you have a preferred outlook on how that would finish?
Interesting question. I took a slightly different view of what Amias Morse was saying yesterday. I think, first of all, it's unarguable that the responsibility, the statutory power to audit HMRC is with the National Audit Office, and that won't change. They're a very big UK government department, and the NAO audits them. But further than that, the NAO was very willing to talk about a range of options for making sure the Scottish Parliament gets the assurance that it needs, including working very closely with us and potentially over time transferring some of the responsibilities for either doing the audit work or, more likely, reporting the way that it works. The way that would happen is still up for discussion. We don't have a detailed plan for what needs to be in place by when, other than the fact that we both have an annual cycle by which we have to complete the audits and report to our respective parliaments on the HMRC preparation, Scottish Government preparation, and the way that those things are interacting. And in many ways, what we're keen to see is the Memorandum of Understanding and any other agreements that are required, making it as clear as possible what it is we both need to audit in exercising our responsibilities. I think it's worth being clear that given the lead time to the Scottish rate of income tax, I think we're pretty well placed for that. But I'm keen we do use the time available to pin down the things that matter in advance of there being a live Scottish rate of income tax that we're needing to give assurance up to our respective parliaments about.
Just very briefly, I appreciate what you're saying, and as I did say in my own comments, that Mr Morse did make it clear that he was willing to work very closely with you. I was interested to hear you say that you felt that Audit Scotland may well have a place in auditing. It wasn't the impression I got from Mr Morse yesterday. I got the impression that, as you say, there's statutory responsibility, and then after that, information would be passed to you in some form, either through joint working or else it would just be passed on.
And that's certainly the current statutory position that came across very clearly yesterday, and that I absolutely recognise as being the status quo. I think what I was hearing from Amias Morse was a sense of, first of all, a real recognition about the Scottish Parliament's interest in the Scottish rate of income tax as being a very significant part of your the expenditure that you have available for public services in Scotland, and a recognition that things will continue to evolve. I think he used a very vivid phrase about letting the dog see the rabbit at one point, and I think there's a recognition in there that the existing arrangements probably need to develop a bit further to give you the confidence that the Scottish Parliament's interests are also being taken care of as part of the new tax collection arrangements. Perhaps I can ask Mark to talk you through some of the existing ways of working we have with the NAO on a range of related, although not exactly the same, sets of expenditure, and talk through what some of the options might be. I would stress very much in the medium term as all of this evolves. Mark.
Yep, thanks, Caroline. Just to pick up on the first of those points, I think it's worth emphasising that across a range of audit work, we already have pre-existing arrangements with the National Audit Office in some of the detailed work that we do, where we work together to reach common outcomes. One of the strongest examples the committee will be familiar with, the previous committee will be familiar with, is around European funding and the way in which we work together with colleagues in the National Audit Office and indeed the audit institutions of the rest of the UK to work together to a single report, single opinion on European funding issues. We also have similar arrangements in relation to working to build up whole of government accounts at a UK level and in some work around forestry and in a number of other areas. So we have those working relationships, and I think that helps illustrate where this may get to, and that I think we need to distinguish between who does a lot of the detailed work and has the access to the information and the evidence, and how judgments are formed from that. And I think we'd find it difficult to envisage a situation where we would not in some way work in partnership with the National Audit Office about things like how do control systems work, what's the detail of the arrangements that are in place in the HMRC. They have the evidence about that, they have the understanding about that. It would be inefficient as an audit process for us not to look to try and make something of that, even in some of the more extreme, if we can use that phrase, examples of our involvement. Even in those cases, I think we'd look to use that information. I think broadly there's a number of models that are available to us, and I think Amias Morse yesterday indicated his willingness to talk about those number of models subject to that underpinning in the agreement. I think those models involve different degrees of our involvement in undertaking work and making judgments. But each of those models, I think we'd be very keen and reliant on working together and in partnership with the National Audit Office to reach those judgments. I think ultimately, again, Amos Morse indicated this yesterday, that might involve the Auditor General making reports based on information that we've shared and we've gathered together with the National Audit Office. We're not quite there yet, but that might be one of the outcomes of this journey.
Okay, right, thanks for that.
Okay, Mr. Scott.
Thank you. Apologies for having to attend the Referendum Bill Committee commendably brief meeting of that. Could I just follow on from both Mr. Doran and Mr. Coffey's thoughtful questions? Firstly, on the OBR, my understanding is the Scottish Government are investigating, because the Finance Secretary answered a question in this Parliament the other week, investigating, as it were, a MAC OBR, or there'll no doubt be some much more elegant phrase for it, elegant title for it. Is Audit Scotland involved in that work, and is it too early yet to understand how that will play into this whole, as it were, audit architecture that we envisage arriving in the next few years?
I'll ask Mark to pick up the detailed question. As part of his audit of the Scottish Government, he's staying very close to the overall preparations that the Government's making for the implementation of the Scotland Act. Mark?
I think on the broad question, I think I'd start by distinguishing between the role that the OBR would play in a Scottish version of an OBR and the role of audit. I think those are different things, and therefore I wouldn't anticipate immediately that that would be a role for audit. I think that it's a valid question. I think it's a question that the Scottish Government is paying attention to. I think from our perspective, what we'd look to see is some vehicle to consider and establish arrangements for forecasting, arrangements to understand what the impact on the economy is likely to be, some arrangements for the interplay between financial management and management of the economy, and a vehicle for doing that. As to what the preferred option for that, I think that's ultimately a policy decision about how best to do that. But certainly, as we continue to talk to the Scottish Government and keep an eye on their progress, we'll be looking to make sure that that capacity to do those sort of things is built into their arrangements.
Thank you. And the second point was on the answers you've been giving to Mr. Doran in respect of the relationship, the emerging relationship with the National Audit Office. We can't have auditors auditing the auditors, is what I'm guessing you're driving at here. Would that be fair? Because the principle here should be that there is a proper audit of government, proper audit of public expenditure, and in respect of the tax, that is the same principle. But it's not your job or their job to, as it were, audit each other, is it? We need to be clear about who is doing the auditing and then what is the role of the respective other parts of the architecture. I think that latter point is spot on. I think the broad point is that there are all sorts of instances right across society and the economy where auditors place reliance on each other's work for very good reasons. There's no point as all duplicating the same things. And I think this is a good example where that can work to support the interests of both the UK Parliament and the Scottish Parliament, and there's a bit more work to flesh out how that would work in practice. And in that context, thank you. And in that context, is Mr. Scanlon's question correct that you have, Audit Scotland have a very clear understanding of how that needs to work, or is it, and what those, as it were, lines of communication should be to allow that to occur, or is it still too early to know precisely what that, I'm going to use this architecture word again, what that architecture looks like? It is too early, partly I think because it's not yet clear what it is any of us will be auditing. There's this first question about what HMRC is required to account for in relation to SRT that builds a little bit on the provisions within the draft Memorandum of Understanding. And there's then a discussion between us and the NAO around what audit work is needed to audit that, what assurance is required by both parliaments, and what the right reporting lines are to cover that. Great. Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Dornan has a follow-up, I think.
Yes, I do. Thank you. Just further to Tavish Scott's point there, the issue here is not so much about who's auditing in terms of we trust NAO and are going to do the job properly. It's about reporting back to this place. I mean, Audit Scotland reports back to here, and it's about that journey between them doing the information and being able to report it back to the Parliament. And that was the point I was trying to make earlier on.
And for the record, I absolutely recognise that. I think it's very clear to all of us, the NAO and Audit Scotland, that both parliaments have got a real interest in this, and both parliaments need to have that interest satisfied. I think we can fulfil those interests by working together in the way that I've just outlined, but we don't yet have the detailed arrangements in place as a blueprint for how it would work. That's work that's still to follow.
Thanks. Just to round up just to check my understanding of that exchange and to ask a question then following from that. What you're saying, Auditor General, is that there is no doubt that only the NEO have statutory access to HMRC to extract the necessary data and information, but that in your view it would be entirely possible and in line with the way you work with NEO already for, once that data has been extracted, you to work with NEO to process it and form a judgment from it. Is that right?
Broadly, yes.
Yes. My question then is, where would that agreement be assured? Would it be in the Memorandum of Understanding, or where? Or is it simply an informal agreement that you have with NEO as you have around forestry and the other areas that Mr Taylor referred to?
I think there would be real value in setting it out clearly in a document that's agreed between the parties involved. It could be done in the Memorandum of Understanding. It could be done in a side document related to it. There is the related minor issue of the statutory basis for both of us for doing those reports in future to the respective parliaments. And I don't have a strong preference as to where it sits. I think getting the clarity now is the important thing, rather than it sitting in any particular document at this point in time.
Okay, that was very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. We'll suspend for 5 minutes for change of witnesses and the relief of the committee. We'll reconvene and welcome our second panel on this topic from the Scottish Government, Alistair Brown, who's Deputy Director of the Finance Directorate, and Jonathan Sewell, who's Principal Policy Analyst from the Finance Directorate as well. Mr Brown, you want to make some opening remarks?
With your permission, thank you, Convener. Just briefly, the committee might find it helpful to have a little background on what our role is. I'm responsible for the overall programme of work in the Scottish Government that's required to implement the financial provisions in the Scotland Act 2012, insofar as the Scottish Government is responsible for these provisions. So that includes the devolved taxes, the borrowing powers, and our elements of the Scottish rate of income tax. That involves us working very closely with HM Revenue and Customs on preparation for the Scottish rate, and Jonathan is particularly closely involved with that as sitting on HMRC's project board, which is planning for the development and introduction of the Scottish rate. On the Scottish rate, we're obviously working within the detailed provisions in sections 25 and 26 of the Scotland Act 2012. And where we talk about estimated costs, we're working to the published estimates that the UK Government produced back in November 2010 when the original Scotland Bill was introduced. So when we talk about estimated costs, we're referring back to papers published then. And as the committee's heard, the estimate then, it was and it remains between £40 and £45 million to introduce the Scottish rate, and between £4 and £4.5 million a year from 2016 onwards to operate it. Our aims as officials working in this area is to ensure a reliable system for collecting all the Scottish rate of income tax that is due, to ensure that a good service is provided to Scottish taxpayers, and all at the lowest cost achievable, consistent with accurate, reliable tax collection and a good service. And we're also clearly interested and want to ensure the provision of adequate assurance and relevant information about the Scottish rate to this committee and to the Scottish Parliament as a whole. We are seeking to achieve this by working with HMRC at official level. We're, as I said earlier, Jonathan is a member of the project board. I also sit on a programme board that looks across all of the financial elements in the Scotland Act. So, as members of the programme and project board, we're receiving papers, proposed timescales, proposed cost estimates, and we have the opportunity to ask questions about these and probe HMRC. And the arrangements for doing that are under preparation, but they're set out in the draft memorandum of understanding that the committee is aware of. Then our key aims, just to continue, as far as the set-up phase is concerned, to make sure that there are robust arrangements in place for identifying all Scottish taxpayers, and then for keeping that list, that database, up to date. That's absolutely basic and essential. We are also aiming to scrutinise costs to ensure that we understand HMRC's estimates and how they're made up. I should say composed, and also any options for reducing these costs or for seeking additional features which may cost more. All of that is within our scope. We need also to understand what information will be available to us from HMRC's systems about Scottish taxpayers and the tax they pay. That's all in the set-up phase. And then from April 2016, all being well, we move into the operational phase of the Scottish rate, and our key aims there are to be able to monitor tax receipts, to understand compliance activity that takes place in relation to the Scottish rate, to understand any risks about tax compliance and tax collection. We will want to be able to track service levels available to Scottish taxpayers and obtain management information about the operation of the tax, all enabling us to track performance and service standards. And I think one final point about the Scottish rate is that everything we do and that HMRC does has to be robust to stand the, let's say, the weight of the Parliament deciding to vary the Scottish rate if it chooses to do so away from 10 pence. And then finally, Convener, just to round that off, we're also involved in the work that was discussed in the earlier session on forecasting receipts from the Scottish rate, and in the work with HM Treasury on calculating the block grant adjustment. That all falls within our team's work. I hope the committee finds that helpful.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Mrs. Scanlon, you want to start?
Yes, can I just be boringly predictable and ask the questions that I've asked today and yesterday? And it really is about getting the clarity now and to look at what level of detail is reasonable and perhaps what level is unreasonable. And I have my little list here. For example, is it reasonable to ask on the progress on the costs of setting up? Is it reasonable to ask for specifically Scottish taxpayer compliance levels? The performance in collecting Scottish taxes, and is also reasonable to ask for the Scottish taxpayers' level of error, fraud and write-offs. We've already been told that the customer service performance is more UK, and perhaps that's maybe not entirely reasonable. But on those four issues, setting up, compliance levels, performance and write-offs, would that be a reasonable level of detail to ask from HMRC in order that the auditing and scrutiny arrangements would be acceptable for future?
What I can certainly say to Ms Scanlon is that they're highly relevant questions. They all bear on the task here of setting up a system and then collecting Scottish rate of income tax. Just to briefly refer to each of these, the costs of set-up and progress, progress on estimating these is obviously a key issue. In section 33 of the Scotland Act 2012, there is a requirement on both governments to report to both parliaments. It's a shorthand, but section 33 lays that obligation of statutory annual reporting on progress with implementing Part 3 of the Scotland Act, and Part 3 is the financial provisions. So there is at least a statutory requirement that progress should be reported to the Parliament annually. And it would be safe for the committee to assume that progress report would include estimates of costs and, in due course, costs incurred. As regards compliance effort and performance and errors, fraud and write-offs, these questions clearly relate to the period after 2016, when the Scottish rate would be underway, would be collected. And as I say, I think these are highly relevant questions. The degree of detail that we have at this stage about the information that will be available is, well, there isn't detailed information yet available. These are issues that we would expect to be following up with HMRC as this project progresses.
Just ask two supplementary questions. You said that my questions were highly relevant. Are there other highly relevant pieces of information that we should be asking for at this stage? And secondly, given that Jonathan is on the project board at HMRC, is it more wise to ask for the level of detail now while the systems are being set up in the next couple of years, rather than asking for them later on when there could be a significant change and perhaps a significant increase in the cost in the system? To
take the second of these questions first, Ms Scanlon, I very much agree that it's sensible and wise to signal well in advance what management or accounting information we would find helpful to have, so that computer systems, for example, can be designed from the beginning to produce these, and that's likely to be cheaper than otherwise it would be, and much easier to provide. Your first question was, were there other areas of information that it would be sensible to ask about? And that gets us into quite detailed territory about tax and how it works. And there is certainly information that we will be interested in once this tax is up and running, partly because of the, not directly related to the tax itself, but information about tax collected and trends over time in tax collected gives, for example, an insight into the performance of the economy. And that is the kind of information that we will want to discuss with HMRC officials about having that sort of fine-grained information available to us.
That's actually looking at the complete revenue figure and forming a trend, rather than looking at the information required within the HMRC accounting process. Yeah. Yes,
and it would relate to the aggregate of tax collected rather than to specific issues about compliance
so it's more on a macro than a micro level.
You could say that.
Yes, I think you did answer the question about the IT systems. I don't know if Jonathan needs to go there.
I didn't think to that.
I think it's just fair to say that, given the interest that the committee has shown in this, it'll certainly be a point I'll be bringing up and looking at where in the process we need to address it. As I said, we're still at a very early stage in the project.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's fine.
Mr Dornan.
Thank you, Convener. A couple of questions which I believe I hope are connected. What role does the Scottish Government envisage Audit Scotland playing in relation to the Scottish rate of income tax? And further to that, how will the Scottish Parliament be kept informed of any key decisions or significant changes to existing expectations in relating to the cost, timing or quality of the systems, aside from the annual implementation report?
Yes. On your first point, as to the role of Audit Scotland, that is something that is under discussion with Audit Scotland, and the committee's hearings yesterday and today have, I think, moved forward consideration of these issues. As Caroline Gardner said in the earlier session, there are important points to be discussed between Audit Scotland and National Audit Office, who are accustomed to working together, but not on the collection of tax. So they are already discussing with one another audit arrangements and the role of Audit Scotland. These discussions obviously will develop further. The Scottish Government would defer to the Auditor General on what the best arrangements are, but what we would say is that we want a high standard of assurance upon which this committee can rely and upon which we can rely also. So I think we're all at one on that. Your second question was about arrangements for keeping the committee and the Parliament as a whole informed about progress with the Scottish Rate project. And earlier, responding to Ms Scanlon, I mentioned the statutory annual report. I think that's a matter, obviously, for the committee to consider whether they think that a report on an annual frequency would be adequate, or whether they want something more frequent than that. And clearly that is a matter for the committee, and I'm sure that Mr Swinney and officials would want to respond as best they could to requests for additional information.
Can I just have a follow-up in terms of something that I raised with the Auditor General? Do you have any idea of the timeline for formalising the audit arrangements?
You would be taking me out of my area of knowledge if I try to answer that. I think that we will be working closely with Caroline Gardner and her colleagues in the next months to further refine the audit arrangements and the nature of the agreement that should exist between Audit Scotland and National Audit Office. the obvious point to make is that the auditors, these two bodies, the NAO and Audit Scotland, are independent of government, so we can't tell them what to do, but we can certainly discuss with them what it is that they plan to do.
Would there be a sort of latest date where that arrangement would need to be in place for everybody to feel comfortable about it? I'm not looking for the date, may I add? But
yes. Well, from a purely technical point of view, the two sets of auditors would need to reach agreement before they finalise their audit plans for the first year in which the Scottish rate operates. That's still some way in the future. I would think for other reasons the two sets of auditors would want to have a written, or I'm anticipating what they arrive at, but I think for other reasons the two sets of auditors would want to have agreement sometime in advance of 2015, which would be the year before the Scottish rate coming in.
Mr. Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. One thing that came out yesterday, and which I raised with Audit Scotland also, was the fact there seems so little detail within the £45 million cost. It seems a very notional figure. And yesterday we heard for the first time that £10 million of that was IT, and the rest was various other things. And there was some lack of clarity when I was asking questions on to what extent performance reporting costs and so on were incorporated in that. Does the Scottish Government actually have a breakdown of that figure?
The figures that we have are simply those published by the UK Government alongside the Scotland Bill in November 2010. So, as I said in my opening remarks, that estimate is now quite old, but it hasn't yet been updated. As Jonathan said, the project to bring in the Scottish rate of income tax is at its early stages. It's at the planning the project stage. One of the streams of work within the project is to develop more refined, more accurate estimates of cost. But inevitably, that the work of refining the cost estimates does depend on the planning work progressing. What I think it would be correct to say, and I should add, that we are dependent on HMRC in developing their cost estimates. But what I would expect is that by the time that the first statutory annual progress report is produced, excuse me, under Section 33 of the Scotland Act, which will be no later than the first anniversary of the enactment of the Scotland Act, which is May 2013, we should see some development of the cost estimates by then. That's what I would expect.
Given the fact that the cost estimates we've seen so far are purely from the UK Government, are there any cost estimates from the Scottish Government for the costs that are being incurred notionally or actually on their side?
You're referring to any costs within Scottish Government as opposed to the fact that we've got to pay the costs incurred by HMRC. Yeah. The costs that we envisage in relation to SRIT are the costs of people like Jonathan and me, parts of our time sitting at our desks or travelling to London to attend project board meetings and the like. So they would be absorbed within the overall administration cost and subject to the controls that apply to that.
Okay. I've been asking about the role of the Scottish Accounting Officer and the fact that it's not a statutory post, and so it doesn't quite equate to what we know as an accountable officer. Do you envisage any difficulties because of that difference?
You're referring to the additional accounting officer, Edward Troop, who was before the committee yesterday. Yeah. And as Caroline Gardner helpfully clarified earlier this morning, the responsibility that Edward Troop has, he's appointed by the principal accounting officer for HMRC, who's Lynn Homer. But these formal accounting responsibilities are to the UK Parliament. And again, as Caroline Gardner pointed out, what HMRC are saying and what the UK Government as a whole is saying is that Mr Troop will attend meetings when asked to do so. He will attend meetings of the Scottish Parliament and its committees and answer its questions. But it's absolutely correct to say that there is not a formal or statutory reporting line from Mr Troop to the committee.
Do you envisage any difficulties because of that, or any issues?
Provided that the work required to develop the Scottish rate of income tax project moves smoothly, and that the tax itself, once operational, doesn't give rise to any major and unforeseen difficulties, I would expect that the arrangements that have been set out should work and work well. The committee will have its own view on the conversation it had with Mr Troop yesterday. Difficulties tend to arise where things go wrong, and part of our job is to do our best to make sure that things don't go wrong.
This committee has recently been taking evidence on ITC projects, a lot of which have not gone particularly well. I assume that we've learned the lessons from that, and that certainly from the point of view of the Scottish Government's participation, that these lessons will be put to good use.
Yes, it's a very good point, which as a public official I strongly agree with, and we followed with interest both the Audit Scotland work on ICT projects and the committee's hearings on that subject. What I can say that may be helpful is that while the responsibility for developing the IT elements of the Scottish Rate project lie with HMRC, we will be able to look at papers relating to the planning of that work and the commissioning of it and the undertaking of it. And if we wish to, we can have our own ICT colleagues in the Scottish Government cast their eye over these papers, offer us comments, help us to challenge or to probe. I'd just like to ask Jonathan if he has anything to add to that.
I think that's true, that we'll have full access to all the documentation of the project, and so any kind of technical specifications we can bring away and share with our procurement experts. If it needs to be, there's an official dispute process for the IT costs where it can be taken to an external arbitrator to establish what the true costs are if there's any doubt.
Mr Doran, was that a direct supplementary?
It was on something that Colin had mentioned earlier on.
Okay,
thank you. Right, very briefly, we have a rough estimate of costs, 40–45 million, as you say, they're kind of out of date. The Scottish Government say that they are responsible for any reasonable costs. What if the Scottish Government say that these costs aren't reasonable? At what point, I mean, whose decision is it that the costs are reasonable, and what happens after that?
Yes. If there was dispute about whether a cost was reasonable, then Jonathan's described that within the IT elements of the project, there is the draft memorandum of understanding describes a process whereby we can commission a third party to check costs, and these would be IT costs quoted by HMRC's contractual partner, their IT partner. So there's an opportunity to establish reasonableness there. The balance of the cost, something like 30 or so million non-IT, then we as officials would be looking very carefully at cost estimates and breaking them down, or asking HMRC to break these down into items and rates so that we could reach a judgment on whether what they were proposing was reasonable. If a situation arose where there was just no agreement between us and our HMRC colleagues at official level, then the draft memorandum does describe an escalation process which would eventually see whatever the issue was discussed between ministers of the Scottish and UK governments, and a resolution would be reached at that level.
A follow-up?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. That was one of the points. In the draft memorandum 2.2, exactly what you said about independent assessment. But what it doesn't clarify, it mentions about estimated costs at additional costs. Who pays for these independent assessors to come and look at that if there's a dispute? Does the Scottish Government pay for it, or is that...
Yes.
So it's 2.2 under IT systems.
Yes. The answer is that this, if we sought an independent assessment of costs, it would be at our initiative, and HMRC would expect the Scottish Government to meet the cost of that independent assessment. It is, if you just point, Ms White, to the second bullet in paragraph 4.2 of the draft MOU, which refers to the cost of any independent assessment. I understand from HMRC colleagues that these costs are not hugely high. They would be measured in thousands of pounds, but not tens of thousands, is my understanding.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to clarify that point, but obviously Audit Scotland's report on IT contracts, it's not been thousands of pounds, it's been millions of pounds sometimes. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but so the cost, if we are not happy and we perhaps see there's something untoward or a mistake or whatever, the Scottish Government and the taxpayers of Scotland have to pay to get that assessed independently. That's the point I wanted to make, and that's in the Memorandum of Understanding.
Just to be clear, the point in 2.2 and then in the second bullet of 4.2 refers to the costs of having an independent party come in to review the cost estimate provided by HMRC or their supplier. So if we felt that that cost was too high, we can have it reviewed, and the cost is a desk review by IT experts. We would pay for their time. That's what's provided for.
We still have to bear the costs, and if the IT system itself is found to be wanting, the Scottish Government would need to pay that again, I'd assume.
Brown's answered the question.
Yeah.
Mr Griffin.
Thank you.
It's on paragraph 6.3 in the Memorandum of Understanding, it states once SRIT becomes operational, HMRC will provide information to the Scottish Government in a form and at a frequency to be agreed throughout the year, and that's in relation to compliance, performance, etc. Do you think it's appropriate that this paragraph is in the format that it is, or should it be in the Memorandum of Understanding? Particularly on the form of information that is provided in advance.
So your question is, should we set out in an annex or something like that what the precise information required is?
Yeah.
Is a very reasonable point. We have seen the Memorandum of Understanding, the draft, as providing a framework within which a number of pieces of work would then be taken forward over time as our understanding and HMRC's understanding of the task developed. And I think from the point of view of flexibility and being able to respond to developing understanding and appreciating what requirements might be, then I think I would prefer to see the memorandum maintained as a framework with scope for agreement to be made on individual elements of the work within that framework. But I take the point, and the committee may have a view on that.
I think the form of information will be important to allow the government to analyse compliance and performance, particularly if you heard my question earlier. I think we have an issue of the accountability of HMRC to this Parliament if their performance is lacking, and then that impacts on our budget. What would the Scottish Government's position be if HMRC's position was worse in terms of performing and collecting the Scottish rate of income tax as opposed to the rest of the UK?
Clearly, that to some extent is a hypothetical issue, projecting our minds forward to when the tax is in operation. I think the first point to make, in agreeing with you, is that it will be important for us to have sufficient information about the operation of the Scottish rate to be able to judge how well it is being implemented and how well the tax is being collected. Your substantive question was what would happen if we thought that HMRC were not abiding by the provisions in the draft memorandum which state that their compliance activity will be comparable pound for pound and so on. And that would have to be a matter for discussion if that situation arose, discussion and plans for rectification with HMRC.
I know that from your answer previously, there is a dispute resolution section which applies to the costs. Would it not be appropriate for a dispute resolution paragraph to be included, particularly in section 6 as well, just to cover that scenario that we've talked about?
Yes, excuse me, I'm just reminding myself what the dispute resolution paragraph 4.6 says. Yes, you're quite right in pointing out that the dispute resolution paragraph really relates to the set-up project of establishing the Scottish rate and doesn't refer to the ongoing arrangements for running the tax. You make a fair point, and that's something we could look at, bearing in mind that this is a draft, and part of what we're all engaged on here is examining it and making sure that it's complete. So we'd be very happy to look further at the point you've made.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Griffin. Mr. Scott.
Thank you. Can I just briefly lead you back to the evidence that HMRC gave to the committee yesterday on IT? I presume you are familiar with the evidence they gave in respect of their confidence in their ability to run a successful IT system, the record they've got, and how that might compare with other things that have gone wrong in a UK sense or indeed in a Scottish sense. You were comfortable with that evidence in terms of how they led that yesterday?
As far as I'm aware, it was factually accurate.
Yeah, quite. Okay, thank you. I really wanted to ask about reporting to this Parliament by the Scottish Government, and you mentioned that earlier on, Mr Brown, that your helpful memo to this committee makes mention of Section 33, but I can't find anything specific in the memorandum at all which relates to how the Scottish Government will report to this Parliament in any other sense than the annual report that you correctly identified earlier on. Is your contention that that's kind of up to us? We need to make the case as to what information we'd like and on what regularity and so on and so forth?
Yes, the context, obviously, of the Memorandum of Understanding is that it's a non-statutory agreement between the Scottish Government and HMRC about the framework to be placed around the development and operation of the Scottish rate. So it doesn't govern the kind of information that the committee or the Parliament as a whole would wish to see from us. We would want to respond, as we do in other contexts, respond to whatever requirements the PAC might have. I can think of several issues in which we're committed to providing half-yearly reports or copies of key documents to the committee. And if you identified issues of that kind, then we would want to respond as helpfully as we could.
Indeed, but we're into new territory here, and this is the first opportunity this committee, indeed Parliament, has of setting up mechanisms to ensure adequate and appropriate scrutiny of government, both in this context HMRC and also the Scottish Government. So we kind of need to know we need to know how best to design that isn't obviously an onerous obligation on either, but ensures adequate scrutiny. You'd accept that?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also an issue on which I would suggest that the committee may want to take the view of Audit Scotland, given their recent work, highly relevant work on ICT projects and in general.
Thank you, and that brings me to my second point, which is the split between, as it were, the audit functions of compliance and the other areas that Mark Griffin rightly just mentioned, as opposed to the management information the government, you mentioned earlier on, Mr Brown, the government want to gain from the collection of the tax and what that means economically. There is a difference there in terms of that information, and it wouldn't be for this committee, I suspect, on that second area. That's probably for the Economy Committee or something like that, but that's not my point. My point is, in parliamentary terms, how do we make sure now we put in place some mechanisms to ensure that flow of information that you, the Scottish Government, wish from HMRC also is available to Parliament?
Yes, one answer to your question would be that if the information is available to the Scottish Government, then it would be available obviously on request to the Public Audit Committee. It's probably worth just saying here that would exclude any information from which individual taxpayers can be identified. But yeah. I don't think anybody is thinking of that. So the information that the Scottish Government will need to satisfy itself that HMRC are collecting the right amount of tax, and that compliance work is being undertaken appropriately, that arrears are being followed up, and so on. These will all be issues on which we'll wish to derive comfort. We too will be looking at the audit work of the National Audit Office on the Scottish rate, and we heard the Auditor General's comments about that. So, as well as the UK Parliament and the Scottish Parliament deriving some assurance from the work of the audit of HMRC, we will be very interested in that as well. And we will be continuing to work with HMRC officials to ensure that we understand the significance of their compliance and collection work.
Thank you. And that does mean that in the future we won't have a recurrence of the situation which happened with a single variable rate, the Scottish variable rate, where Parliament wasn't told at the time that very significant change had been made. That was obviously, from a parliamentary point of view, a bit of a concern.
I'm sure that Mr Swinney and his officials, including me, would be anxious to ensure that didn't recur.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
If I could also add, I think it's fair to say as part of the implementation project, HMRC colleagues are paying a great deal of attention to what our deadlines and requirements are for reporting to committees and Parliament. Although the project's in the early stage, that conversation is definitely taking place.
Okay, Mr Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. In relation to the set-up costs and running costs, it does seem to me, having heard the conversations over the past period, that Scotland's basically been asked to sign a blank cheque here. We don't know how much we'll ultimately pay, and we don't know when we'll know how much we have to pay. That seems to be a bit of a precarious arrangement to set out on this course of action. But I wonder if I could ask about the OBR issue in the first assessment for the cut and block grant, and to ask Mr Brown, is there any indication of what the value that might be, and why from my reading there is no agreement to reconcile any error in making that assessment. I think that stating that if it's an underestimate or an overestimate, then either party will take the benefit or the risk. But it seems to me that if there is an error in there, then the impact of that error in the Scottish budget is much, much more significant than the effect of the error consequently to the UK government. So I'm just wondering why there isn't an agreement to reconcile that perhaps in the following year. So firstly, Mr Brown, I wonder, is there any indication of what the value of the first cut will be, and what our thoughts are, the Scottish Government's thoughts are, in having an agreement about that value and reconciling any differences?
I'll do my best to answer these questions. The OBR, which is independent of UK government, although set up by them, exists largely to produce economic and fiscal forecasts of the UK economy. It produced, I think I'm right in saying, in March, on the 21st of March this year, its first estimate of tax receipts flowing from taxes that were then set out in the Scotland Bill. So there is in existence a published report from OBR which estimates receipts from the Scottish rate, assuming a 10 pence in the pound rate, and also estimates of receipts from stamp duty land tax in Scotland, which is being devolved, and landfill tax, and indeed aggregates levy as well. So the committee would want to be aware of that publication. My recollection, I don't have a copy of it with me, but my recollection is that OBR estimated the total take from the Scottish rate of income tax, were it in place now, were it to be in place now, at 4.5 billion, which implies that a 1 pence rate would yield 450 million. Is that approximately your recollection? 4.7.
4.417 billion for 2012-13.
Right. Thank you, Convener. And projecting forward, because they produced a projection forward to 2016-17, I think it got to about 5.6 billion. Thank you. Just can I check that answers that first question?
It takes us along the way, but I mean, imagine the scenario where there's even a 1% error on that. That's equivalent to £45 million shy one way or other side of the line, which could have quite a significant effect on what the Scottish Government might want to do. In terms of there's no agreement to reconcile that. I don't understand that, because it's quite clear that it could be reconciled the following year, so that it does balance. Why is that?
If I can just come in on that in answer to the question, the arrangement. The arrangement for striking the block grant adjustment and then adjusting the adjustment is set out in the command paper Strengthening Scotland's Future, published in November 2010, and it describes in some but not full detail the arrangements for reconciling and adjusting the block grant adjustment. And we're working with Treasury officials on the detail of that, and we need to bring it back to ministers for agreement in due course. But what we envisage is that the block grant adjustment would be struck for the first year on the basis of a projection, because there isn't any actual outturn, obviously, before the year begins. We then would allow the tax year to run, the financial year to run. Actual receipts from the Scottish rate of income tax aren't all received in the year in question. If, for example, you're a self-assessment taxpayer, you wouldn't fill in your tax return or have to pay your tax until up to 10 months after the end of the year to which the payment relates. So towards the end of year 2, we should have a reasonably accurate figure of the actual receipts. And the proposition, as set out in the UK Government's command paper, is that actual figure would then be compared with the forecast and a reconciliation carried out. We're now nearly 3 years after the beginning of the first year, and at that point there would be a further adjustment to the block grant adjustment to take account of the reconciliation from year 1. Now, it's fairly complicated stuff, but there is an acceptance that because of the difficulty of projecting receipts from the Scottish rate of income tax, there must be a form of reconciliation at a point where that can be done accurately.
That's more encouraging than I'd anticipated.
Mr. Scott, as a
follow-up. One very small supplementary on that, just following on from Mr. Coffey's question. That reconciliation that Mr. Brown has very eloquently described would also go hand in hand with the year-on-year reconciliations that happen in government accounting terms anyway, because of end-year flexibility, which I well remember as a minister, which were agonising at the time. So it would be fair to say there is always uncertainty at the end of every financial year. This, if I may say so, just adds another degree to it. Would that be fair?
Yes, the reconciliations and the end-year flexibility that you refer to, Mr. Scott, are to do with spending the money, and the reconciliation that I've been attempting to explain is obviously to do with income, and it's good to keep the two distinct in our minds, but you're right to draw attention to the fact that there will be a degree of uncertainty in future once these taxes are established. There will be some volatility and some uncertainty about the size of the Scottish blocks.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Mr. Sewell, Mr. Brown, for your reply. Please excuse me, Ms. Scanlon has supplementary.
Oh, sorry, it was just for some clarity on my earlier question. And my understanding was that we had this basic system agreed between Scottish Government and HMRC. And I think my list that I gave earlier was what I understood were optional extras about performance, compliance and write-offs of tax. And I apologise, I should have read your submission before asking the questions, because I'm now slightly confused. In page 2 of the government submission, the second last paragraph on compliance, it says, and I quote, HMRC will, once SRIT system is up and running, conduct risk analysis and assessment and compliance and anti-avoidance activity on individuals, etc., in relation to Scottish taxpayers and others. So my question is, is this all included in what's happening at the moment? Because I think my earlier question was to say, what level of detail do we need? What should we be asking for? And I apologise, because it seems to me that what I was asking for has already been agreed. Am I confusing myself? Or?
I would just, I suppose, flag up the distinction between the work that will be done. It would have to be done by any competent tax authority. The business of compliance work and assurance, analysis and assessment, the passage that you've read out, and the information that would be available to us about that as it applies to Scottish taxpayers. And that, when we think about the information that we would seek, so that we could satisfy ourselves that that work had been done, I think the comment I would make is that gets down to a level of detail that we haven't yet reached.
No, but what we're really asking is, what information do we need for Scotland in order to ensure that we understand compliance, performance, write-offs, etc. My point is that in here, it's quite clear on compliance, HMRC will conduct risk analysis, etc. Now, if they are going to do that, and that's going to be unique to Scotland, then it's easy just to put it and give us the information. So what I'm saying is, what I was asking earlier, it appears to me that it is now included rather than an optional extra that we'll have to pay for.
It would be very easy to say yes. Yeah. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that this work must be done, and it will be done, as you're quoting. It will be done.
Will be done.
Yes, and some of the work will be simply a continuation by HMRC of the compliance and assurance work that they do across the UK on income tax. Some of it, however, excuse me, some of it will be specific to Scotland, insofar as it relates, for example, to the status of Scottish rate, or rather Scottish taxpayers. That's specific to Scotland. HMRC will have to, must and will conduct compliance and assurance work on that. As an example, they want to check a sample of Scottish taxpayers every year to ensure that they remain Scottish taxpayers, that they're properly coded as Scottish taxpayers. That's simply an example of assurance work that would be specific to Scotland.
It's just that on compliance, it seems to be further down the line, according to your submission, than I previously understood.
If I'd had my wits about me, I would have drawn the committee's attention to that.
If I'd had my wits about me, I would have read it before I asked you the question.
If I'd had my wits about me as convener, I would have finished 10 minutes ago. So we do need to draw this session to a close. Thanks once again to Mr. Sewell and Mr. Brown. Thank you very much. The committee will now move to private session. We'll pause for a moment while the public gallery is cleared.